Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bob Miller, and I'm president of the John Hurford Foundation, as well as a member of the board of the Foreign Policy Association. It gives me great pleasure to host this annual Foreign Policy Association John Hurford Memorial Lecture. John was a longtime benefactor of the FPA and coupled his interest in the financial sphere with a abiding interest in international affairs. He was twice a Fulbright Scholar in India. He chaired the board of his alma mater, Haverford College, a big benefactor of the Harvard Business School, as well as a loving husband who I believe widow is Hilga Hurford, is with us tonight, and a virtual hello to Hilga and to John's daughter, Jennifer. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Eric Posner of the Chicago Law School, where he is the Kirkland and Ellis Distinguished Professor of Service, and where he holds the Arthur and Esther Lane Research Chair. He is a prodigious author in areas of his interests, which include financial regulation, international law, and constitutional law. He has just released a new book entitled The Demagogues Playbook: The Battle of American Democracy from the Founders to Trump. One can hardly think of a more timely book, which is said to include a blueprint on how America can protect itself and its democracy, and certainly, hopefully, provide some answers that will work for us going forward. Professor Posner will talk tonight for approximately 30, 35 minutes and has also agreed to take questions. Members of the audience have submitted questions to me, and which I will ask at the appropriate time. So without more, Professor Posner, we look forward to your remarks.
Thanks so much, Bob. Let me share my screen here. So I'm going to talk tonight about my new book, The Demagogues Playbook. And by the way, thank you very much to the FPA for this invitation. It's a real honor to be able to speak to you. I wish I could speak to you in person, but this is the next best thing. So my book, yes, it is timely, right? I hear there's an election going on, and I have on good authority that the winner will not be declared for at least an hour. So there's no reason for you to be distracted, to look at your phones or the television. You can just enjoy my talk. And let me jump right in. Okay, oh, there we go. So I'm going to talk about demagoguery, and I'm going to talk about demagoguery in the context of the presidency. And the demagoguery is a phenomenon that has been with us in the United States since the founding, and in fact has been a feature of democracies since classical times. The founders, when they put together their new the new republic, the United States of America, were concerned about demagoguery. And what they were concerned about precisely was this. they were creating the first large-scale democracy since the Roman Republic, or I shouldn't say democracy, I should say a republic featuring popular sovereignty and limited government. So, at the time, most governments were monarchies or aristocracies of various sorts, with the quasi-exception of Great Britain, which had a mixed constitution. So the founders had to look back to precedents from ancient times. So there was Athens, which was a real democracy, and then there were other Greek city-states that were democracies, and there was Rome, which was a republic, meaning that while the principle of popular sovereignty was important, there were significant limitations on people's ability to vote and participate in government. The recurrent problem in ancient Greece was the problem of the demagogue. Democracy was considered the best system by many people because ordinary people got to participate in self-government, and that was considered a high ideal. But the problem is that from time to time, a demagogue would show up. Now, a demagogue was a charismatic, persuasive person, usually a wealthy person, and often an aristocrat or somebody with significant connections, who would persuade the ordinary people that he was on their side, and that if they just gave their support to him, he would overthrow what he would inevitably call a corrupt elite system of aristocrats who ruled in their own interest and not for the ordinary people. Because even then, even when there was a democracy, there was always an elite. There were the wealthier people, the people who had a history of kind of an aristocratic lineage, and those people always had more political power. Ordinary people resented them. Now, this type of argument by the demagogue, there's nothing wrong with it in the abstract. Of course, if an elite is running the republic in a way that benefits them at the expense of the people, there's something wrong. But the problem with the demagogue was, rather than try to make reasoned arguments so that the people would support him and allow him to implement good reforms, the demagogue would stir up anger, would appeal to the negative emotions, greed, fear, resentment, and often make promises that he couldn't keep and use lies to confuse people. And inevitably, demagogues, of course, didn't always get power, but when they did, the city-state or the republic would be badly run and often would collapse into civil war and ultimately monarchy. And often this would happen cyclically. These civil wars were devastating. This was not something the founders wanted to repeat. Now, it did happen in Rome as well. Of course, Rome had this extremely admirable, from the founders' perspective, 500-year republic, which ultimately was undermined by demagogues, ultimately Julius Caesar, and that civil war followed, and then a dictatorship was introduced, the empire of Augustine. So as the founders set up the government, they were thinking, we've committed ourselves to popular sovereignty. That's what the revolution was all about. And so people need to, of course, participate in government. That's both good and just under the circumstances. But we also have to prevent the people from electing a demagogue. And to prevent people from electing a demagogue, the founders introduced into the Constitution a number of institutions that you might think of as bulwarks against demagoguery. So first of all, representation, which we now take for granted. But in ancient Athens was not a representative democracy. The people ruled directly. There were officers, but they were selected by lot. The founders thought that you needed representation so that experienced, educated politicians would make the actual decisions. Ordinary people could elect them, of course, but ordinary people wouldn't be able to make the decisions directly. And they were worried, of course, about people being swayed by passion and making uninformed decisions, whereas the professional politicians would become experienced and knowledgeable and be able to make good decisions on the people's behalf. The founders also were relatively comfortable with franchise limitations, which at that time existed in the states. franchise limitations basically prevented really poor people from voting, or sometimes not so poor people from voting. And while some founders opposed them and they were all a little uncomfortable with franchise limitations, the justification for them was that you want more educated, more experienced people participating in government. Now, an important bulwark was the Electoral College, which we hear about now all the time. Nowadays, we think of the Electoral College as this kind of strange, archaic system to ensure that thinly populated states have disproportionate representation in the selection of the presidency. But at the time, the founders actually thought of the Electoral College differently. The whole point of the Electoral College was to prevent people from voting directly for the president. The founders were worried about allowing people to choose the person who would occupy such a powerful office. And so what they did is they said to everyone, well, what you can do is you can vote for someone called an elector. An elector would be a local personage, maybe a minister or the president of a college or a wealthy banker, someone that everybody knew and respected. And then that person would vote for the president in the Electoral College, but that person would just use his discretion and judgment. He wouldn't care what ordinary people thought. He would, he would just make a decision that he thought was in the public interest. And the combination of all of these things was that an elite system was created, a system in which the elites of the country had more political power than ordinary people. This was recognized at the time. The founders were a little embarrassed about it, but the opponents of the Constitution, known as the Anti-Federalists, made a big deal about this. They said, look, we've been ruled by the British aristocracy, and what you want to do is create an American aristocracy. Now, the founders didn't think in those terms. They just thought, look, you want to be ruled by the people who are educated and successful because they're the ones who are most likely to make the best decisions. Well, this system was not very popular, actually, from the beginning. George Washington, the first president, entered office with enormous prestige, and he was a terrific president. He exercised judgment, and he tried to act in the public interest. But he was surprised by the virulence of the attacks that he received from the press, and he didn't really get it that in the United States there was going to be this opposition to the government that was noisy and unpleasant, and he actually quite disliked being president. But he made it through okay. He made excellent decisions. The problem was his successor, John Adams, who was not as skillful a politician and was not did not enjoy the prestige that George Washington had as the victorious general in the Revolution. Adams also was an intelligent person, and he meant well, but the attacks on him from the people who didn't like his administration thought it was too favorable to merchants in the Northeast, and should have supported France and so in the Revolution and so forth. Eventually, he acquiesced in a statute called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically imposed censorship on the critics of the president. This was extremely unpopular, and Adams was defeated by Jefferson in the next election. Now, Jefferson was not a man of the people, but he did believe more in popular sovereignty than Adams did. Adams actually was a kind of an aristocrat in thinking, in the way he thought. Jefferson was more of an aristocrat than Adams was in his tastes and deportment, but he did believe in democracy, and he did believe that ordinary people could exercise judgment wisely. But Jefferson created what's come to be called the Virginia dynasty, an actually fairly elitist top-down system. And in the meantime, some of these bulwarks I talked about began to erode. So because most people hated this idea that elites would rule and that this person called the elector would select the president rather than ordinary people, the states passed laws that required the elector to vote the same as the popular vote in the state. So this initial idea almost immediately collapsed, and franchise restrictions eroded as well. So more and more people could participate in government. And over about 20 years later, in the 1820s, we get the first president who I think was a demagogue, Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson is often considered a great president. He's often in the top 10 lists that historians have produced, but his reputation has been sinking over the last few decades. What made Jackson a demagogue was that he was the first to engage in a kind of a mass campaign to try to rile up the people to vote for him. And rather than making kind of reasoned policy arguments, he said that he should be president because the existing government was corrupt. And so this idea of corruption quickly becomes a trope in demagoguery. The existing establishment is corrupt. I'm going to fix the corruption. Jackson was famously deprived of the presidency in 1824 as a result of a bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. The bargain was a kind of an ordinary political deal, but Jackson brilliantly called it the corrupt bargain, and the name stuck. He said, the quotation at the bottom of the screen, "The Judas of the West that's Henry Clay, has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. Was there ever witnessed such a barefaced corruption in any country before?" Now, in fact, Henry Clay didn't receive a bribe of any type, but Andrew Jackson was able to present this sort of normal functioning of elite politics as corrupt, because Jackson had received more votes than anybody else, but because of the way the system worked, he wasn't allowed to become president in 1824. So in 1828, when he runs the second time, he waves the flag of the corrupt bargain. Jackson was also a violent person, an angry person. He was someone who felt a great deal of resentment toward the elites. Jackson himself was an elite. You know, he was a wealthy guy. He owned slaves. He owned a huge plantation, the Hermitage. But he felt like an outsider, and he made his outside status a big part of his appeal to ordinary people. Now, the real reason why he was elected was he was a famous general. It wasn't because of his political experience or his political accomplishments, which was quite meager. It was because he won the Battle of New Orleans, which made him famous. Now, Jackson entered office without any real program. He just wanted power. But he did two things, both of which were devastating for the United States. He destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, which was basically like the Fed today, a little weaker than the Fed. He hated the bank for reasons that historians don't really know. They think maybe he had trouble with banks in his business career. They're not really sure. But he went after it and destroyed it. That involved, firing cabinet members who wouldn't cooperate. This was not a popular position until people realized this is what he wanted to do, and then his supporters became anti-bank as well. The bank was a terrific institution, way ahead of its time. It did a great job of handling financial crises or preventing them from occurring in the first place, in dealing with various structural problems with the American economy. The Bank of England was comparable at the time. Having destroyed it, the United States then suffered through numerous financial crises through the rest of the 19th century until finally the Federal Reserve Board was created in the beginning of the 20th century. So this was a demagogue who, he didn't really have a program, but he hated the bank, partly for maybe biographical reasons, but also because it was a major power source independent of him. And so he had to go after it. The other devastating consequence of Jackson's tenure as president was that he destroyed the civil service. So the United States at the time, the federal government had a superb civil service, the envy of other countries, including Great Britain, for example. The civil service mainly consisted of, wealthy, educated people, not always wealthy, but definitely educated people, sort of semi-aristocratic types from the Northeast, who took their job seriously and were basically honest by the standards of the time. When Jackson ran for president, he or his aides realized that one way he could get people to support him was by promising them positions in government. He didn't have money to bribe them, but he could promise them good jobs if he was elected. And that became known as the spoil system. So when after Jackson was elected, he fired a lot of people, and through attrition, he was able to hire a lot of people. These people might have been excellent campaigners, but they didn't have any experience in government, so they were mediocre and somewhat corrupt civil servants. The spoils system would really get going after Jackson's tenure. By the time of Lincoln, Lincoln famously said that the appointing people to government was more of a threat to the health of the Union than the Confederacy. A disappointed appointment seeker assassinated Garfield later, and eventually Congress passed the Pendleton Act, which created the civil service we have today, which created job tenure and required people to have merit. But that took 50 years. So this is the danger of having a demagogue in office, which is that their programs tend to be negative. They want to, they're willing to manipulate and damage the government in order to consolidate power. Now Jackson, although people often refer to Jacksonian democracy, Jackson didn't actually create a democracy. What did happen is that his lieutenants, notably Martin Van Buren, who would be his successor in the presidency, created a new system of politics featuring big mass parties, what we now think of today as the Democrats and the Republicans. And there was something democratic about these parties in the sense that pretty much anybody could join a party and get involved in politics if they wanted to. But the parties were controlled by elites. They were controlled by the professional politicians, by elected office holders, by former office holders, people we think of as superdelegates now. And so those people would vet presidential candidates and make sure that a demagogue wouldn't be up for election, because professional politicians, they don't like demagogues. Demagogues do a bad job. Demagogues disrupt things. And the parties performed this important vetting function all the way into the 1970s. What is demagoguery after all? It comes from the Greek for people and leading. And you might think, well, what's wrong with leading the people? That's what a democratic leader does. Why do we use this negative term, demagoguery, to refer to such people? And one clue to this is that demagoguery is not really about substantive aims. There are left-wing demagogues, there are right-wing demagogues. I'm not talking about Republican or Democratic policies. What I'm really talking about is a style of politics. And the style of politics should be distinguished from the substance. So I'm going to talk about Huey Long and Charles Coughlin, American demagogues, in a little bit, but modern examples would be Chavez or Bolsonaro in Brazil on the left and right. And basically the difference is that left-wing demagogues try to get power by appealing to the poor and promising to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. And right-wing demagogues get power by appealing to the majority and promising to transfer power, status, or possibly money from minorities or foreigners. So right-wing demagoguery tends to be nationalistic and xenophobic. I put together this little table to try to spell out in a little bit more detail the difference between a demagogue and what I call a statesman, who you could think of as an ordinary politician. And what a demagogue does to get power and retain power is appeal to negative emotions, fear, hatred, prejudice. The left-wing demagogue might say the rich people are horrible, and the right-wing demagogue might say that some minority group, religious or ethnic or racial or foreigners are they're vermin, they're animals. So they stir up anger and fear in the population. A statesman doesn't do that. The statesman might appeal to reason or interest or to positive values like solidarity and national unity. The demagogue wants personal power. The statesman, of course, wants personal power also, right? That's what motivates politicians, but they tend to care about the public good genuinely as well. Demagogues tend to be amoral, narcissistic, and sometimes violent people, like Andrew Jackson, who killed several people in a duel. Statesmen tend not to be like that. They're not always virtuous, but they're more virtuous than demagogues are. Demagogues try to obtain authority by attacking it, right? They go after the elites, the people in the establishment, the government, the media, the courts. Statesmen don't do that. They claim authority because of their experience, because they have expertise, because they're good people, they have good characters. Demagogues tend, in order to obtain power, to appeal to abstract goals because they don't want to commit themselves to any particular program. Whereas statesmen tend to say, look, you know, we need to raise taxes or lower taxes. We need health insurance, or we need to strengthen NATO. That's the sort of public goal that a statesman will advocate. The demagogue style is vulgar, angry, and divisive. Vulgar comes, the Latin root of vulgar is the people, the masses. You might have noticed that demagogues swear a lot, you know, in their speeches. Statesmen try not to do that. And finally, this is key. Demagogues' attitude toward institutions and expertise is hostile. Now, statesmen don't always like institutions. You know, you might come to power if you're a statesman criticizing the FBI or the courts or the media, but they tend to be more respectful about it and to advocate reform. So if you think, you know, the FBI is bad, rather than just attacking it, you say, this is what we should do to improve it. We should change how the director is appointed, for example. Now, obviously, these are ideal types. There's no pure demagogue and there's no pure statesman. It's always a matter of degree, but I think these ideal types are helpful for thinking about politicians. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead in history to the late 19th century. So demagoguery is often associated with populism, which is a bit unfair to the actual populists. The populists were farmers in the Midwest and the South in the late 19th century. These farmers legitimately believed that Washington disregarded their interests. We're not paying attention to them because of corruption, of course, but mainly because the cities were gaining power and status. Business was becoming more important. And so the populists organized their own party, which they called the People's Party. And the reason why populism got this bad reputation is that they were uneducated people, so they believed weird things. They believed in conspiracy theories. They often said stuff that was strange. But the reality is they actually had a lot of good ideas that were later adopted in the United States in the 20th century, or at least reasonable ideas. They were really sincere and they went to great efforts to educate themselves. Many of their leaders were actually quite reasonable. William Jennings Bryan, who's famous, one of the great famous political leaders of the time, he wasn't in the People's Party, he was in the Democratic Party, but he was sympathetic to the populists. He, you know, you read his speeches, they're not like Andrew Jackson or Donald Trump's speeches. They are uplifting and unifying. But there were real demagogues. The Southern demagogues became a kind of a type. Tom Watson was an example. He was a senator from Georgia, originally a Democrat. He briefly flirted with populism and actually hoped to organize former slaves and poor white people to create a new political force in Georgia. But he quickly realized that that coalition wasn't going to work, and it worked much better to work for the planters, for the elites, and the poor white farmers by appealing to racism. He started a newspaper which stirred up hatred and division by attacking Black people, Jews, Catholics, on behalf of the white people in the South. One of his charming headlines was, "When mobs are no longer possible, liberty will be dead," right? This is like the classic demagogic attack on institutions. The mob is like the classic kind of negative of an institution. He didn't actually do anything good for the poor white farmers or anybody else in Georgia. He did help inspire the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. In the Great Depression, the most famous demagogue of the time was Huey Long, who was actually a kind of an amazing person. And if you're interested, you can find on YouTube videos of a speech that he gave, or a couple of them. He was brilliant intellectually. He was totally amoral. He wanted power, and he got it at a very young age. He became governor of Louisiana and then subsequently senator, and ultimately could very well have become president, but he was assassinated. Huey Long was a left-wing demagogue who obtained power by promising stuff to the poor, money to the poor, schools, books, roads, and so forth. And he did deliver. So he has a kind of a mixed reputation. He did help poor people. And Louisiana really was a very corrupt state with an oligarchy that disregarded the interests of the poor and enriched itself. So Huey Long came along and tried to put a stop to that. But the problem was this demagoguery. He went after the rich as corrupt, tried to undermine them, and made promises to the poor that he couldn't keep. Worse, once he was in power, he was one of the most corrupt politicians ever. He, basically using bribes and threats, he obtained control of the legislature and the courts and the administration, the bureaucracy and the corporations. He could threaten the corporations. He even controlled the university. He'd get professors fired and things like that. He was basically a dictator. And the reason he was able to become a dictator was that the institutions of Louisiana were weak, and he was able to subvert them and gain control over them. Now, Franklin Roosevelt himself was often accused of demagoguery, and I don't think Roosevelt was a demagogue at all. He was, on the contrary, a great president and a unifier. But he did use demagogic rhetoric from time to time, and he lied, which is, something that demagogues do as well. Roosevelt's lies, though, were of a special kind. He lied about his intentions to keep the U.S. out of World War II. And as hostilities started with Germany, he lied about whether there were conflicts between, for example, American ships and German U-boats. So presidents do lie. We know this. Eisenhower famously lied about the U-2, the spy plane, and other presidents have lied. Bill Clinton lied about his personal life, his affair. But these lies tend to be rare. They're not always justified. Sometimes they are, but they're not, a constant pattern, the way they were with Huey Long, who just would basically say whatever he thought would get people to vote for him. All right, I'm almost done here. I don't want to spend too much time with these people, but George Wallace was another Southern demagogue who, did pretty well in national politics as well. Wallace was a racist and got power in Alabama based on his racism, but to broaden his appeal in a presidential campaign so that people in the North would vote for him, he famously on Meet the Press said this is a movement of the people, and it doesn't make any difference whether top leading politicians endorse this movement or not. And I think that if the politicians get in the way, a lot of them are going to get run over by this average man in the street, this man in the textile mill, this man in the steel mill, the barber, the beautician. They are the ones, those are the massive people that are going to support a change on the domestic scene in this country. And this kind of reckless appeal to the people, which is often associated with populism, and attack on the elites, the people in government, is a mark of a demagogue. This type of rhetoric would be used by Nixon and Reagan as well, though I don't think of either of them as a demagogue. Nixon was a bit, Reagan was a little bit also, but they were basically normal presidents or politicians. But what did happen was this anti-establishment theme became a part of our normal politics. Okay, that brings us to Donald Trump. So you've probably figured out what I was going to say. Is Trump a demagogue? Yes, he's a demagogue. He obtained power through demagoguery, and he has up until just a minute ago. No, that's a joke. I don't know whether he's still going to be president or not, but he's maintained his power through demagogic means. Appealed to the negative emotions, anger at foreigners, anger at minorities, anger especially at the elites, the liberal elites, the bureaucracy. He was definitely amoral. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know whether he's narcissistic or not, but he definitely doesn't seem to have much of a moral compass based on everything we know about him. His claim to authority is, of course, this anti-elitism. He's either a billionaire or a millionaire or possibly broke, but he appears to be wealthy, but that is part of the pattern. The ancient Roman and Greek demagogues were also wealthy, or at least apparently wealthy. They were usually in debt as well. His style is vulgar, angry, and divisive. And his attitude to government officials, this is also well known. I'm not going to read all of these attacks. But this is totally uncharacteristic of any president in our history. I think even Andrew Jackson, this constant attack on people and institutions, most of whom are perfectly respectable. They may have problems, but they're not necessarily corrupt or failures. His use of corruption, by the way, is constant. You can just do searches in various databases of his tweets, and he attacks everybody for corruption, which again is a trope of the demagogue. So what difference does it make that Trump is a demagogue? Well, I think, the problem with a demagogue is that they divide the country. They stimulate negative emotions. They make it hard to govern. And the demagogue, once in power, having achieved his goal, often doesn't know what to do with his power. Trump, interestingly, in many respects, simply followed the normal Republican policies that his Republican predecessors had, although his attitude toward foreign affairs and immigration is new, driven, I think, from his xenophobic attack on foreigners, which helped him get elected in the first place. Now, Trump has already called the election, even before we know the outcome, a major fraud on our nation. So he has attacked not only courts and the Congress and governors and mayors and everybody, he's attacking the electoral system itself. And the worry here is that if he undermines confidence in elections, people won't accept them. They won't believe that the election actually reflects the will of the people. That is very dangerous for a democracy. If Trump is not reelected, maybe the last 4 years will not do any permanent damage to our institutions. We won't know until we see. If he is reelected, I'm not one of the people who think that Trump will become a dictator or an autocrat. But I do think I will be worried about how our institutions are going to survive, our democratic institutions and our civic institutions, or I should say how they're going to recover given his reckless attacks on them. And with that, I would be happy to take some questions. So you're on mute, Bob.
Yes, there, thank you. Do you hear me?
I hear you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I wonder if you would say something about your attitude on the electoral. I know you spoke about the electoral college, but a few years ago, Frank Fukuyama also gave the Hurford Lecture of the FPA, and I think he was raising questions about revisiting some of the structural elements of our founding. This election, I think, is so far running in the popular vote about, I think the former vice president is about 4 million ahead. And should he lose, I mean, it all sort of raises this issue of direct election. What's your view?
Electoral college is, hopelessly archaic and very bad for democracy. When the Electoral College was created, part of what was going on was America was more like the European Union today. The states had more sovereignty, people were more loyal to the states. So it was important for the states to have equal representation at some level. And that's part of the reason why the Electoral College gave, more influence to the smaller states relative to their population. But, that was then, that was in the 18th century. People aren't as loyal to their states today, and that sort of system doesn't make as much sense. In addition, the difference in population between the biggest state at the time, which was Virginia, and the smallest, which I believe was Delaware, was not that much. It may have been about 10 times. Whereas now the difference between the population of California, which is 40 million, and Wyoming, which is 300,000, is enormous. So this kind of disproportionate impact of the Electoral College has gone from tolerable to absurd. So something has to be done about the Electoral College. I agree. But the problem is it would require a constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm. And then one of the founders biggest mistakes was they made the Constitution almost impossible to amend. It requires supermajorities in the House and Senate, and then most states as well, a supermajority of states. The Republican Party benefits from the current electoral college system because they have more support in the less populated states. So they're not going to agree to an amendment that reforms the electoral college. So we're stuck with this for the short to medium term. Now, some Democrats have suggested that, we could create a couple more states, like DC and maybe Puerto Rico, and you could do that without a constitutional amendment, and that could help a little bit. But I think the electoral college system will be with us for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of things that have certainly changed, or frankly weren't even in existence at the time of the founding, what's your view of the social media concerns in terms of its impact on the electoral process and politics generally?
Yeah, well, I think I share what's becoming the conventional wisdom that social media is a real serious problem. I think I could add something though by reminding people that this is not the first time that a new technology has disrupted politics and given power to populists and demagogues. So, probably the most direct analogy would be the development of broadcast radio in the 1920s and the 1930s. So before then, it was quite difficult for presidents to communicate directly with the people. They could give speeches, but not more than a few thousand people at a time. And by then the population was vast. They could, hope that the newspapers would quote their speeches, but the newspapers, either didn't or would just quote a snippet. They could, fund their own newspapers, but then people might not buy them. So it was very difficult for the president or people who wanted to be president to communicate with, with the vast majority of voters. Radio changed that because now the person, being interviewed on the radio or giving a talk on the radio can be heard by thousands and thousands of people all across the country. So Huey Long realized that and made the use of radio a big part of his attempts to reach out to ordinary people. So did Charles Coughlin, the priest. He was basically a kind of a right-wing anti-Semitic priest who was an isolationist and tried to prevent America from entering World War II. Coughlin had tens of millions of listeners. Tens of millions of people could hear Huey Long as well. And their kind of violent rhetoric, of course, it happened before, but never before could the entire population of the country, hear the words of a single person making these dangerous attacks, which appealed to their prejudices and worries and xenophobia and all the rest. So what happened? What happened was Franklin Roosevelt eventually got the FCC to regulate the radio. And over time, the government put pressure on radio stations to, not to let people like that give speeches. Of course, this is kind of anti-democratic, kind of elitist, but that's what happened. And eventually, of course, radios are owned by big corporations that don't want to rock the boat by allowing demagogues to give speeches. So that's what happened, and it's happening again with social media. And I suspect that something similar is going to happen in response, that the government either directly or indirectly is going to get the social media platforms to regulate content. In fact, we already see this happening, right? And this will continue, I suspect, for the next few years.
If the former vice president is successful in the election, what advice might you give him if I picked up the phone and called you out in Chicago?
Well, I'm always hesitant about giving politicians advice. I'm an academic and I don't have the knowledge that they have. But this is what I would suggest. Everything depends on whether the Democrats get at least a tie in the Senate or not. And I gather that has not been determined. if the Democrats do not have, half the Senate, if they're a minority in the Senate, Biden's hands are tied. He can do stuff. He can maybe persuade Republicans to support some modest legislation like a stimulus bill. Maybe, he can appoint people. He can revive environmental regulation. There are things he can do on his own, but he's not going to be able to persuade the Republicans to agree to reforms that damage the Republicans, unless, of course, there's some kind of backlash to Trump, and Republicans want to distance themselves from him. Then maybe they would agree to some reforms. If the Democrats get a majority in the Senate, Biden could do much more. I think probably, there are a lot of things that could be done. Unfortunately, some of these things might be blocked by Supreme Court, but campaign finance reform would be helpful. Ethical restrictions on the president that are somehow enforceable would be helpful, including, for example, requirement that they release financial information like their taxes. Restrictions on using the government, stronger restrictions on using the government for partisan reasons. Those could be put into place. But I think, ultimately we need very serious constitutional reform that would require amendment of the Constitution. And that's not something I think that Biden can do in the short term.
There has been talk about a court packing plan. I gather Vice President Biden is not particularly favorable, but and with, as you say, with a divided Congress.
Well, yeah, and I think it would be political suicide to pack the court. I understand the impulse. I do think the Democrats are going to face a lot of pushback from this court if they try to enact ambitious legislation. But packing the court, it's not going to work. Roosevelt tried to pack the court in 1937. Roosevelt was infinitely more popular and politically powerful and admired than Biden is, although Biden is a very admirable person. And it blew up in his face. People were not willing to go along with the court packing plan because they were worried that Roosevelt was getting too powerful, and they respected the court, even though it was very right wing and had blocked a lot of popular legislation. The Supreme Court is actually still a fairly popular institution in the United States, and has been for the last couple decades. Unlike Congress, Congress is not popular. The public opinion polls suggest that maybe 10 or 15% of the population respect and trust Congress, whereas for the court, it's more like 50, 55%. So I think even moderate Democrats in Congress would not vote for a court packing plan, and without their support, there's no way to enact one.
Mm-hmm. You, at one point during your career, had been at the Justice Department in the Office of Legal Counsel, and that's an organization which seems to me to have been compromised during this past administration in terms of institutional damage and to its credibility. Is that of a particular concern that you might have?
Well, yeah, the Office of Legal Counsel is an office in the Justice Department. It's really they give advice to the Attorney General and to the President. They were involved in famous, questionable types of advice during the Bush administration, particularly, which may have damaged their reputation. I'm not sure the Office of Legal Counsel is really the source of problems with the Trump administration. I think most people are critical of Barr, the Attorney General himself, for allowing Trump to use the Justice Department for partisan reasons. I think there's some truth to that. I think Barr did not act with the kind of full integrity that we would hope for. I think, some of his decisions, while they may have been objectionable, are well within the tradition, because the Justice Department does historically defend the president. It's part of the executive branch. And I think the Justice Department has in many ways shown a lot of independence. It's pursued investigations of presidential cronies. The civil servants in the Justice Department, I think, are very good. And I think even many of the political appointees have acted in a reasonable way. There's a lot of institutional inertia. There's a lot of independence. So I think the Justice Department has probably survived its contact with Donald Trump, at least for now.
Mhm. You also mentioned, as I recollect, in terms of campaign finance reform, you would like to see things tightened up. For someone, it's not clear to me how important money is in politics. I guess I may be naive in saying that, but I mean, if you're an incumbent, for example, you have some name recognition. I mean, I think it's good to, certainly it's helpful in getting that out there. But am I being naive and suggesting that we don't need a lot of reform?
It's a very tricky topic. Your point is a good one, that money can help challengers overcome the incumbents' natural advantages. I think, though, in reality, it tends to be the incumbents who get the money.
Yeah.
They're a known quantity to the people who are giving the money. The effect of money on politics is very complicated. People who have studied it, though, do tend to find in their empirical studies, which are, they're always open to question, but they tend to find that money does have influence, that Democrats and Republicans will show more preference for wealthier people than for poorer people, presumably because they're worried about losing donations. There's a limit on what you can do in a society like ours, but I do think, part of it is, you can restrict money without getting rid of it completely. You can restrict, for example, corporations from giving money, even if you don't restrict ordinary people from giving money, subject to the Supreme Court's, veto. The Supreme Court doesn't agree with that, but it might be persuaded otherwise. I do think that, I'm also worried about sort of self-financing billionaire types. Trump is not the first one, but he is the first successful one. Well, apparently George Washington was one of the wealthiest presidents in the United States, but he didn't have a campaign. Nobody opposed him, so it didn't matter. But in the case of, people like Steve Forbes and Ross Perot, these people from 10 or 20 years ago, there's really no reason why they should have, been politicians. They just had a lot of money and they were interested in doing it. And I think Trump shows that money or celebrity can distort the political process. I don't have any kind of clean, easy reform proposals, but I do think that something should be done about money in politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, may I ask you to ask yourself a question?
A question?
And this will be the last question.
Sure. So I actually, I got a good question. So here's a good question. Has Trump damaged America's institutions? Has he damaged the courts by attacking them? Has he damaged the FBI or the intelligence community? Has he damaged the media? Has he damaged the electoral system by undermining people's confidence in it? So I think this is a great question. And, part of the answer, we're not going to know, but if Biden becomes president, we'll find out whether these institutions have been damaged. I, assume that they have, but we don't really know. And I was struck because I looked at the Gallup poll numbers. Gallup has historical poll data on people's attitudes toward government institutions and civic institutions like the media. And so every few years, or I think every year, Gallup asks people, do you trust Congress? Do you trust the president? Do you trust the media? And I was really kind of surprised to find that there hasn't been that much change over the last 4 years. Now, trust in general in the government and government institutions is pretty low, except for the military. And it's lower than it used to be in the 70s. It seems like the 1960s Vietnam and Watergate badly damaged people's trust in government, and it's never really recovered. It went down a lot in the 70s, and then it's kind of been declining very slowly since then. And it was declining before Trump entered office, and it's either declined or is probably in a statistical sense not that different. The one exception is that people stopped trusting the FBI after Trump started attacking it, but even that has recovered. So the FBI's reputation among ordinary people is back up to where it was, back up today to where it was before Trump entered office. Now, these public opinion polls don't tell you much, but they're open to interpretation. But I do think maybe we shouldn't panic. I think these institutions, they're big institutions with people who've been there forever and new people who care about them. And there's only so much the president can do to damage them. So I do think that there are grounds to be optimistic, at least if Trump doesn't win re-election, that our institutions will recover and public confidence in them will not go down much more and maybe even improve under an excellent president. But if Trump is reelected, or if another person comes on the scene who's a demagogue, in 2024 or 2028, then I would start worrying.
Yeah. Well, my only quibble with looking at the polls you suggested, the polls preceding this election seemed to have needed a little finer tuning, I think. But on that note, I want to thank you so very, very much for being with us tonight. I was fascinated by sort of the historical and reasoned view. And I think everybody should rush out and buy your new book.
An excellent idea. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.